I swore at the altar to love and honor a man who treated me like a line item in a contract for 8 months. That night, he finally said out loud what he'd been holding back since the wedding. "I don't want you as my wife." I never did. I didn't cry. Crying would have been a gift he didn't deserve. I opened the closet, pulled out the dress he'd ordered me to get rid of, painted my lips dark red, and walked out the door. Hours later, I was at the party of the man my husband despises most in this world, smiling, dancing, and from across the ballroom, I blew a kiss to the capo of the Valieri, the man who had just made me his biggest problem. Chapter 1. The words he swallowed for 8 months. The table was flawless. I knew it was, because I had spent the better part of an hour aligning each fork, each knife, each crystal glass, with the kind of precision that belongs to women who have nothing else to control. 8 months of marriage to Santino Valieri, and I had decided, on my own, since no one in that house ever asked me anything, that the occasion called for at least a well-set table. I skipped the candles. They would have reeked of desperation. I skipped the flowers, too. They would have made me look pathetic. What remained was the porcelain we never used, the wine Santino preferred, and 2 place settings at opposite ends of a dining table built for 12 but occupied, on the rare nights we shared it, by 2 people who had perfected the art of silence. Donna Marta, the cook, had walked me through the risotto before heading home, and the dish waited under its cover on the warming stand, preserving a heat the rest of the house had never known. The Valieri estate sat in Lake Forest, nearly an hour north of Chicago's downtown, and it was vast enough for 2 people to coexist for days without crossing paths. In the beginning, I mistook the distance for a phase, something that would soften with time. It didn't. The distance was deliberate, structural, built into every room. Santino slept in his study, or in one of the guest rooms, and I occupied the master suite alone, which was, in practical terms, the only tangible benefit of carrying his last name. I glanced at the clock. He was late. We hadn't set a time. We rarely said anything together. But I had mentioned 7:30 to Donna Marta, who passed it along to Beck, Santino's head of security, who would have relayed it to Santino without question. The hierarchy in that house functioned like clockwork for everything, except the things that mattered to me. I sat down and stared at the covered dish. The wedding band on my left hand pressed against the bone, a size too small, as it had always been. I twisted it absently, feeling the bite of the metal. I had never mentioned it to anyone. By the time Santino's headlights swept across the dining room window, the risotto had gone cold and collapsed into itself, a dish that had given up before I did. I heard the garage, then his footsteps on the stone corridor, then the low murmur of him dismissing Beck with barely a sentence. My spine straightened on instinct, a habit my body refused to let go of even when my pride begged it to stop. He appeared in the doorway with his jacket draped over one arm and his tie pulled loose. 34, sharp jaw, eyes so dark they absorbed the light before reflecting anything back. In 8 months I had come to understand what the Valieri name meant, not through words, but through the way rooms fell quiet when he entered them. 3 generations of power in Chicago. Business that everyone understood, and no one named aloud. A throne he hadn't been handed. What it cost him to claim it, my father never explained, and I never pressed. Santino ran the family the same way he ran our marriage, with total authority and 0 concessions. His gaze moved across the table, the china, the wine, the careful symmetry of 2 settings, and something flickered at the edge of his mouth. Not a smile, recognition. He understood exactly what I was doing. His response was a single raised eyebrow, a breath through his nose, and his back turning toward the staircase. "Good evening to you too," I said. I didn't stand. He paused on the second step. He didn't look back. "I have work, Ravenna." Quiet, controlled, final. 3 words that carried the weight of every dinner he had skipped, every door he had closed between us. Every morning I came downstairs to find his coffee half drunk and his chair already empty. He climbed the stairs. I stayed where I was, seated before 2 untouched plates and a bottle of wine no one would open, and the shame settled into my stomach, like something I'd swallowed whole. It wasn't unfamiliar. It was just sharper that night, because I had made the mistake of trying. The upstairs hallway stretched long and dim, lit the way Santino liked it after dark. Low, muted, bordering on shadow. I climbed the stairs and stopped outside the study. A thin line of light glowed beneath the door, shifting as he moved inside, and I heard the dull sound of a glass meeting the surface of his oak desk. I knocked. Nothing. I opened the door anyway. Santino stood behind the desk with a whiskey in his hand. the window at his back framing the dark garden and the far-off silhouette of pines. The lamp threw hard angles across his face, and he looked at me the way he would look at someone who had entered without permission, because, in his mind, I had. "I told you I have work. I heard you," I said, pulling the door shut behind me. "But you also have a wife who spent her evening preparing a dinner you didn't bother acknowledging, so your paperwork can survive 2 minutes." He said nothing. He raised the glass to his lips and drank slowly, watching me over the rim with that measured, unhurried patience, the kind designed to outlast whoever stood in front of him. His method for anything he couldn't resolve with a command was simple: hold still until the inconvenience left on its own. I didn't leave. I moved closer until the desk was the only thing between us. At that distance, I could smell the whiskey, the deep woody note of his cologne, and beneath it all, something I hadn't expected: fatigue. I lifted my hand toward his shoulder. Such a small gesture. It shouldn't have demanded bravery. It did. He stepped back. One sharp, reflexive motion, and my hand was left suspended in the air between us before I brought it down. "Why did you marry me?" The question came out softer than I intended. Santino placed the glass on the desk with a controlled click and folded his arms. "You already know. I know the version I was given, that my father had a debt to yours, that I was the currency. What I don't understand is why you brought a woman into your house if you never planned to treat her as anything more than furniture." He held my gaze, and somewhere deep behind those black eyes I caught a tremor, brief, restrained, buried before it could surface. "Ravana, go to bed." "No. I want an answer." He unfolded his arms, planted both hands on the desk, and leaned forward, not close enough to touch me, but close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body into the narrow space between us. And then, in a voice stripped down to almost nothing, he looked me in the eye and said, "I don't want you as my wife. I never did." The sentence landed like something dropped from a height. Precise, heavy, unrecoverable. He didn't flinch. He didn't soften. He didn't follow it with anything that might have blunted the edge, because Santino Valieri did not blunt edges. He said the thing and let the weight of it do the rest. The sting hit my eyes immediately, and the need to cry rushed up so fast it almost buckled my knees. Almost. Because somewhere beneath the pain, a part of me, the same part that had raised Lazaro alone after our mother died, the same part that had signed my life away in silence to keep my brother out of that world, rose before the first tear could fall and refused. Crying in front of him would only confirm what he already believed, that I was soft enough to shatter from a single sentence, and I could be many things. Bargained for, overlooked, erased, but breakable was not one of them. I swallowed hard, raised my chin, and left the study without giving him another word. The door closed softly behind me, and I walked the length of the hallway to the master suite with my back straight and my eyes dry, even as everything inside me was coming apart. I locked the bedroom door and stood motionless in the center of the room, breathing, letting the blow finish reverberating through my body before I allowed myself to think. "I don't want you as my wife." The words returned intact, each one carrying the exact timbre of his voice, and my chest tightened again. But this time, the pain was not alone. Something else was rising with it, a slow, scalding anger that filled every hollow the humiliation had carved. I opened the closet. The dress was buried in the back, behind the heavy winter coats, where I had hidden it the day Santino told me to get rid of it. Red, short, a neckline that made no apologies. I had bought it before the wedding, in a previous life where choosing what to wear wasn't a negotiation. When Santino noticed the shopping bag, he said that doesn't stay in my house without lifting his eyes from whatever document he was signing. I should have thrown it out. I didn't. Now I understood why. I stepped into the red dress in front of the full-length mirror and reached behind my back to pull the zipper up myself, a movement practiced with the fluency of someone who learned early not to wait for help. From the nightstand drawer, I retrieved a dark lipstick from inside a small black case and painted my lips slowly, watching my reflection in the compact mirror. The woman staring back was not the same one who had walked out of his study. I picked up my phone and called Tavi. Ottavia Marchetti answered on the third ring, mid-chew, music blaring in the background. Tavi had been in my life since adolescence, daughter of a straight-arrow Italian accountant on Chicago's West Side, unapologetically loud, entirely fearless, and possessed of a loyalty I had done nothing to earn but that she handed over without conditions every single time. "Rav, what's going on? Do you know where Korvac's party is tonight?" The chewing stopped. A beat of stunned silence. Then Tavi coughed violently. I could hear the olive hit the plate. "Wait, you're asking me for the address of Arsen Korvac's party? The man your husband would happily bury alive?" "That's the one. Another pause. Then a laugh. Disbelieving at first. Then rapidly, unmistakably thrilled. You've completely snapped and I am absolutely here for it. Lincoln Park. Give me 40 minutes. And do not wipe off that lipstick. I hung up and faced the mirror again. The red dress stared back at me with a promise I hadn't allowed myself in 8 months. The promise that I still existed underneath the polished china, the uneaten dinners, and all those nights spent alone in a suite large enough to echo. I smiled, slowly, deliberately, with painted lips and dry eyes, for the first time in 8 months. Santino Valieri didn't want me as his wife. It was time he learned what happens when the woman he threw away decides she still exists. Chapter 2. The Kiss That Crossed the Ballroom. The taxi pulled up to a wrought iron gate in Lincoln Park, and Tavi gave my hand a single firm squeeze before reaching for the door handle. Still time to turn around, she said, but she was already grinning, already stepping out, already tugging at the hem of the black dress she'd thrown on in under 10 minutes, while I stood in her living room trying to remember how to breathe. If I wanted to turn around, I wouldn't have come, I said, and the words sounded steadier than anything happening inside my chest. Arsène Korvac's residence occupied an entire corner of the block, imposing at close range, with floor-to-ceiling windows pouring warm light onto the pavement and a deep rhythmic bass leaking through the stone walls. 2 guards checked a guest list at the entrance. Tavi flashed a smile at the taller one and steered me through by the elbow before I could think to ask how she'd arranged our names on that list. The main hall was vast, crowded, and calibrated. The music set at the exact volume that turned every conversation into a whisper, the lighting dim enough to soften faces into half-formed impressions. Within seconds, I spotted 3 people who had sat at the Valieri dining table. They spotted me too. And from the way each of their expressions shifted, it was clear that the rival capo's wife had just become the most volatile element in the room. Arsène Korvac reached me before I'd made it 10 steps inside. 39, heavy shoulders filling a slate-gray suit, a grin too broad to mean anything genuine, and eyes that evaluated every person present by how much it would cost to own them. I had heard his name surface in Santino's phone calls over the past months, always murmured, always near the end of a sentence, always framed as a problem on the verge of being handled, but never quite resolved. This was the first time I was putting a face to the name, and the face made every one of those guarded conversations make sense. Ravenna Valieri, he said, offering his hand with an exaggerated bow. I had high expectations for tonight. You were not among them. Altieri, I corrected, gripping his hand without hesitation. Ravenna Altieri. Valieri belongs to the contract. The name is mine. Arsène laughed, full, open, with teeth, and the sound carried across the hall like a signal flare. Tavi pressed her fingers into my elbow in a way that meant watch yourself. But I had left caution behind the moment I zipped up the red dress. The music slowed, and Arsène extended his hand for a dance. I understood what it meant to accept. Every set of eyes in that room belonged to someone who would turn the scene into currency before sunrise, and every one of them would know exactly what they were looking at. Santino Valieri's wife, in the arms of the man Santino Valieri wanted buried. I knew all of that. I took his hand anyway. 8 months of being invisible had earned me at least one moment of being impossible to ignore. We danced at the center of the floor for less than a full song. Arsène led with practiced ease, his hand resting on my waist at a distance that was deliberate, not courtesy, but calculation. He knew that a centimeter closer would cost more than the gesture was worth. I felt every gaze in the room land on us, and I smiled, because a smile was the only armor I had brought. Tavi saw him before I did. Rav. She materialized at my side the instant the song ended, her voice barely above a breath. He's here. I didn't need a name. The entire atmosphere of the room buckled. Voices dropped. Postures shifted, heads turned in unison toward the entrance. I turned slowly, and there he was. Santino, standing on the threshold of Arsène Korvac's ballroom with Beck stationed 2 paces behind him, his dark jacket buttoned, his body held with the rigid composure of a man who had not been invited, and wanted that fact to be unmistakable. His eyes locked onto me before scanning anything else. The red dress, the lipstick, Arsène's hand still lingering near my arm. I watched his jaw set, watched the fingers of his right hand curl inward, and I felt, even across the length of that room, the precise instant he stopped thinking and started moving on instinct. So I did the only thing that made sense in that ballroom, on that night, wearing that dress, with all that fury still alive inside me. I looked directly into Santino's eyes, pressed my fingertips to my lips, and blew him a kiss. slow, unhurried, my red-painted fingers unfolding toward him like a declaration written in lipstick. The room went still. Arsene, at my side, allowed himself a smile that was pure strategic pleasure. Tavi's grip on my arm turned to iron. Santino crossed the ballroom. He didn't rush. He didn't shove. He walked with long, weighted strides, and every body in his path moved without being asked. When he reached me, he closed his hand around my wrist. Firm, controlled, not violent, and pulled me toward the side exit without uttering a single word. Arsene opened his mouth, and Santino silenced him with one look that made the Serbian capo step backward. One step. In that room, in front of those people, one step was a public concession, and everyone present witnessed it. Tavi raised both hands. Go, I'll stay. And then I was being guided through the side door and onto the sidewalk, where Beck's black SUV idled at the curb with the engine already running. Santino opened the rear door, pressed his palm against my back to push me inside, climbed in after me, and shut the door with enough force to make the vehicle shudder. Beck took the wheel without a word and pulled into the street. The silence in that car had physical density. I could feel it pressing down on me. I stared forward, pulse racing, breath shallow, and waited. Beside me, Santino looked out the window with his jaw clenched so hard I could see the muscle twitching beneath the skin. The hand that had gripped my wrist now rested on his thigh, fingers still half closed. Have you lost your mind? He said, without turning. His voice was low and steady on the surface, but underneath the steadiness something vibrated, something I had never heard from him before. Anger, yes, but not only anger. I've lost far more than my mind over the past 8 months, I answered, turning to face him. That was just the last thing left. He looked at me. Inside the dark car, his eyes met mine, and the back seat was too narrow for the amount of tension between us. I could feel the heat of his body without contact, could smell his cologne cut with the cold air from outside, and the pulse in my ears was so loud it swallowed the sound of the engine. Arsene Korvac, he said, and the name left his mouth like a sentence being handed down. Out of every person in this city, Arsene Korvac. I didn't choose him. I chose the party that would hurt you the most. He was just the location. Santino's eyes tightened. I could see the effort it took him to hold back, the control reassembling itself piece by piece, and for one reckless moment I wanted him to lose it, to shout, to slam his fist against the seat, to do anything other than retreat behind that frozen composure that made it impossible to tell whether I was reaching him or speaking to stone. Beck drove in silence all the way back to Lake Forest. 40 minutes of darkness, passing trees, and Santino's heavy breathing beside me. The place on my wrist where his hand had been still carried his warmth. Neither of us spoke again. At the mansion, Santino stepped out first and walked inside without looking back. I followed, through the stone foyer, past the dining room where the anniversary table sat exactly as I had left it, plates untouched, wine unopened, and continued down the corridor toward the library at the far end of the hall, where the light was on and the door stood open. He had his back to me, one arm braced against the tall mahogany bookshelf, his head bowed. The library was the only room in the house that felt displaced in time, shelves covering every wall, a worn leather armchair, a fireplace that no one ever used, and a dense smell of aged paper and wood that seemed to thicken the air. I walked in and pulled the door shut. He heard the latch catch, and his shoulders tightened, but he didn't turn. Do you understand? He said, each word slow and deliberate. What you just did. I went to a party. You went to the party of the man who is trying to dismantle everything I've built, wearing a red dress, and you blew me a kiss in the middle of his ballroom. You noticed the dress. That's new. He turned, and the look on his face was something I had never encountered. Dark eyes wider than usual, composure fracturing at the edges of his mouth, and an intensity behind his gaze that made me falter half a step before I planted my feet and held my ground. It wasn't simple anger. Simple anger I could have handled. This was anger laced with something he refused to name, and the combination was far more dangerous than either piece alone. You have no idea what you've started, he said, his voice barely above a murmur. I know exactly what I did, I replied, not breaking his stare. What surprises me is that you cared enough to show up. The words hit. I watched the impact register, a small, almost invisible tightening between his brows, right where the mask was thinnest. He took a step forward, and the room seemed to contract around us. The scent of old books and dark cologne thickened in the space between us, until the remaining distance was small enough that I could see the pulse in his throat beating far too fast for a man pretending to be unmoved. We stood there in a moment that refused to end, both upright, inches apart, the air dense with everything we weren't saying. I could feel his breath near my temple, and my entire body vibrated with a tension that had nothing to do with fear. I wanted him to reach for me. I despised myself for wanting it. Santino lifted his hand, slowly. His fingers hovered an inch from my cheek, and I watched the exact moment he chose not to make contact. His wrist freezing, his fingers curling shut, his hand dropping back to his side with a restraint that looked like it cost him more than he could spare. He walked past me without a word, without touching me, and stopped in the doorway. He stood there with his back to me, one hand gripping the doorframe, and the silence between us was so swollen it felt like it might split open. I waited, because for one suspended second, it seemed like he was about to say something. Not an order, not a directive, not control. Something that belonged only to him. He didn't. He left. The door closed behind him. And I stood alone in the library in the red dress, lipstick untouched, carrying the quiet, certain knowledge that for the first time in 8 months, Santino Valieri had been completely unable to look away. Chapter 3. The Hunt Inside the House. The morning after Korvac's party, I came downstairs in pajamas, hair twisted into a messy knot on top of my head, with the firm intention of not thinking about Santino for at least as long as it took to finish a cup of coffee. I made it as far as the kitchen doorway. He was leaning against the marble counter, mug in hand, shirt open at the collar, scrolling through something on his phone. Morning light poured through the windows and hit him from the side, softening the edges that had been sharp and dangerous only hours before. He didn't look up when I entered, but his jaw shifted, a movement so small most people would have missed it. But I had spent 8 months learning to read the things Santino didn't say out loud. He knew I was there. I crossed to the cabinet, pulled down a mug, and filled it from the pot without a word. The silence between us was nothing like the ones that had come before. For 8 months, the kitchen had held the silence of indifference. 2 people occupying the same room with no particular reason to acknowledge each other. This was different. This silence had weight and grain, and every second that passed without either of us breaking it only made it denser. I sat on the stool across the counter from him and blew on my coffee. He slid the phone into his pocket, and then he looked at me. Not the way he usually did, the brief, efficient glance that confirmed I existed and moved on. This time his gaze traveled slowly, and I felt every inch of it. My face, the loose strands of hair, the oversized t-shirt I slept in, my hands curved around the mug. It was the first time in 8 months that Santino Valieri had actually looked at me without the armor of formality between us, and the quiet force of his attention made me lose track of time between one sip and the next. "Did you sleep?" he asked. The question startled me, not the words themselves, but the way he said them, lower than the voice he used for commands, softer than the one he used for interrogation. A register I didn't know existed. "Barely," I said. "You?" He lifted the mug, drank, and let the silence answer for him. We stayed like that for a few more minutes, him standing, me sitting, the marble counter between us and the lake forest morning expanding slowly through the windows. Neither of us brought up the red dress, the party, the blown kiss, or the library, but all of it hung in the air, solid and undeniable. And the fact that neither of us reached for it only made every passing second heavier. Santino rinsed his mug, adjusted his shirt cuff, and walked out of the kitchen without a word of farewell. I stared at the empty doorway and tried to recall the last time we had shared a room for more than 3 minutes without him inventing a reason to leave. Nothing came. A few days later, Beck pulled the SUV up to the side entrance of an Italian restaurant in downtown Chicago, a discreet place with a stone exterior and a small bronze plaque that read, "Only Valieri." The restaurant had been in the family for 2 generations. Its back room served as neutral territory for business dinners where the food was decoration and the table was a stage. Santino stepped out first and circled the car to open my door. The gesture caught me off guard enough that I hesitated a beat before taking the hand he offered. His palm was warm and dry, and the brief firmness of his grip had nothing to do with tenderness. It was choreography. He wanted me beside him, visible, and the message to anyone paying attention was unmistakable. The capo's wife was not being kept out of sight. The private dining room sat behind a pair of frosted glass doors. Inside, 6 men already occupied the oval table, faces I recognized from the handful of social events where I'd been put on display over the past months. Mid-level capos, strategic allies, men who spoke in low tones and laughed loudly and assessed every person in the room by how much they could be leveraged. Santino pulled out the chair to his right, guided me into it with a hand on the seat back, and settled beside me with the ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times. I understood the role. Smile, nod, offer polite responses to questions that weren't really questions, and maintain the posture of the official wife without stepping onto business ground. I played it perfectly for the first 40 minutes, until a man at the far end of the table decided I deserved commentary. I didn't know his name, only that he was older, wore a ring far too large for his little finger, and let his gaze linger on me a second longer than it should have each time he looked my way. "The capo deserves a toast," he said, lifting his glass toward me. 8 months, and the gem still shines. Most family wives lose their luster by month 3. Polite laughter rippled around the table, the kind men produce when they know the remark has crossed a line, but the speaker's rank shields him from correction. Heat climbed my neck and I opened my mouth to answer, but Santino moved first. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't alter his expression. He picked up the wine glass in front of him, full, red, from the reserve the family cellar kept for occasions meant to impress, and closed his hand around it, slowly, with a steady, deliberate pressure that produced a single crack before the crystal collapsed entirely, wine spilling between his fingers and dripping onto the white tablecloth with a muffled sound that killed every conversation at the table. No one breathed. Santino opened his hand. The shards lay on the cloth like evidence. Wine soaked into his shirt cuff, and he looked at the man with the ring with a calm far more frightening than any outburst could have been. "When you speak about my wife," Santino said, his voice perfectly level, "you will use her name, and you will look at me while you do it." The man went white. He offered a stiff nod of apology, and spent the remainder of the dinner studying his plate. Beck, posted by the door, passed Santino a napkin without being asked. The evening resumed. Conversations restarted. But I carried the image of the wine threading through his fingers for the rest of that week, along with the strange, unsettling realization that, for the first time, Santino had bled for me in front of witnesses, even if the blood was nothing more than red wine from a shattered glass. The following afternoon, Tavi arrived at the mansion with a bag of Panzerotti and the energy of someone who had not been invited and had absolutely no plans to wait for an invitation. She came through the kitchen door, dropped the bag on the counter with a thud, and planted herself on the stool where I usually drank my morning coffee, crossing her legs with the confidence of someone who owned the place. "Before you start," she said, pulling a pastry from the bag and biting into it without ceremony, "I brought beef and cheese, because I know you can never pick, and I refuse to sit through another one of your culinary identity crises." I laughed. It was impossible not to laugh around Tavi, because she entered any space at a volume that forced everything in it to rearrange, and the Lake Forest mansion, with its hushed corridors and its stiff elegance, became absurdly lighter the moment she set foot inside. Beck materialized in the kitchen doorway with the expression of a man who had heard a disturbance and come to determine whether it required intervention. When he saw Tavi, he stopped, leaned against the frame, and folded his arms with the resignation of someone who had long since stopped trying. "Marchetti," he said, nothing else. Tavi swiveled toward him with the pastry half-eaten, crumbs at the corner of her mouth, and smiled. "Orsini, not eating? Or does the battery need a charge first?" Beck regarded her for a full second, one unbroken, unblinking second, and replied without inflection, 9 hours a night. "But I appreciate the concern." "Riveting," Tavi said, tearing off another bite. "I got 4, and I still made it here before your first smile of the day, which, based on historical data, should arrive somewhere around... Never." Beck said nothing. He left the kitchen with the same silence he'd brought into it, and I could have sworn the corner of his mouth moved on his way through the door. Tavi looked at me, eyebrows raised. "He likes me," she declared. "He tolerated you for 12 seconds. By his standards, that's practically a proposal." Tavi laughed, and the sound filled the kitchen in a way that reminded me of the person I used to be before I became the silent wife of a man who slept in a different room. We stayed for over an hour, eating Panzerotti, alternating between whispers and bursts of laughter, until at some point I reached for my phone and called my brother. Lazzaro picked up on the second ring, his voice slightly rough, traffic noise in the background. 19 years old, living in Milwaukee on money I wired through an account Santino didn't know existed, and the only piece of family I still recognized as mine. Since our mother died, I had been everything to him. Sister, surrogate mother, guarantor, a safety net woven out of lies. He believed I was living well. I did everything in my power to keep that fiction intact. "Rav, everything okay?" he asked, and the reflexive worry in his voice tightened something in my chest. "Everything's fine. I just wanted to hear you." The call lasted only a few minutes, short by design, because long calls left traces, and I couldn't risk anyone in that house discovering I had a 19-year-old brother hidden away. When I hung up, Tavi watched me with that quiet, knowing look she reserved for the moments when she could tell I was carrying more than I let on. "Is he all right?" she asked. "He is." I slipped the phone back into my pocket. "He has to be." A few nights later, the mansion was wrapped in the kind of silence that only large houses produce after everyone has gone to bed, thick and total, broken only by the distant tick of the living room clock. I couldn't sleep. Insomnia had become a regular visitor in recent weeks, and that night, the heat beneath the covers and the weight of my own thoughts drove me out of bed and into the hallway. I went downstairs barefoot, wearing an oversized t-shirt, hair loose around my shoulders, heading for the kitchen and a glass of water. The ground floor corridor was darker than the one upstairs. Santino shut off every light when he closed himself in the study, and the only glow came from the thin strip beneath his door at the far end of the hall. I was passing the study on my way to the kitchen when I stopped. The door was open, barely, no more than 2 fingers width, and through the gap Santino's voice leaked out, low, carrying the unhurried cadence he used for business. I should have kept walking. Whatever happened behind that door had nothing to do with me, and 8 months of marriage had made the boundary between Santino's world and the rest of the house abundantly clear. But my feet stopped before my mind made the decision, and I stood there, shoulder against the hallway wall, heartbeat slow and steady, listening. It wasn't a conversation. It was a phone call. The gaps between his sentences were too long for anything other than a one-sided exchange, and no second voice reached me, only the silence of whoever was on the other end of the line. Then Santino repeated a single word twice, low, with a weight that compressed 2 syllables into something that sounded like both accusation and threat. Silas. I didn't know the name. I didn't know who it belonged to, what it meant, or why Santino spoke it with that particular blend of fury and revulsion. But the instinct that had kept me alive in recent years, the same instinct that taught me to read a room before stepping into it, to store information before acting on it, and to never let anyone suspect how much I actually understood, told me to file it away. So I did. I heard the sharp click of a phone being placed on the desk. I took a step back, ready to retreat upstairs before he opened the door, and walked into something solid in the dark. Not something. Someone. Santino was behind me. I hadn't heard the study door open, hadn't heard footsteps in the corridor, and his sudden proximity was so startling that I held my breath. "What are you doing up?" His voice came from above, low and close, and I felt the vibration of it against my skin. "Getting water," I said, and my voice held together better than I expected for someone whose heart had relocated to her throat. I didn't turn around. He was close enough that his warmth reached my back, close enough that his cologne saturated the narrow space between us in the dark hallway. The air thickened in a way that had nothing to do with temperature, and I became aware that neither of us was moving. Then he touched me, just my wrist. His fingers closed around it with almost no pressure, not to restrain, not to pull, just to make contact. His skin against mine was warm, and the touch lasted a second, maybe less, maybe a fraction more. Long enough for every nerve in my arm to fire at once, and long enough for me to know, with a clarity that unsettled me deeply, that he had felt it too. He released me, stepped back, and vanished down the corridor toward the study without another word. I stood in the darkness with my wrist still warm and the glass of water entirely forgotten, and the name I had overheard, Silas, pulsed in my memory, alongside the ghost of his fingers against my skin. 2 things I hadn't asked for, 2 things I couldn't explain, and neither one was going to let me sleep. Chapter 4. A Bullet and a Storm. The storm descended on Chicago at the tail end of that week, with the violence of something that had been biding its time. The sky went dark hours ahead of schedule. Wind began hammering the mansion's windows in sharp, rhythmic bursts, and within the hour the rain arrived, dense, angled, and deafening against the glass of Lake Forest. I was in the suite with a book open across my lap that I hadn't actually read in over 30 minutes when I heard the garage gate. That alone was nothing new. Beck and Santino came and went at every hour, and I had long since stopped asking where they were headed, because the answer was never going to be honest. But that night, Santino had left tighter than usual. I watched from the hallway window as he walked down to the garage with Beck, dark jacket, locked shoulders, jaw clamped in the way that meant he was going somewhere he wasn't certain he'd return from intact. The hours dragged. The storm intensified. I shifted positions in bed 4 times, turned back to the same chapter 3 times without retaining a word, and at no point did I allow myself to admit I was waiting. Admitting that would mean conceding I cared, and caring about Santino Villieri still felt like a line I hadn't given myself permission to cross. Sometime around 11, the garage gate opened again. The SUV's engine, the slam of doors, and then, moments later, voices in the downstairs corridor, muffled, urgent, laced with a tone that sent a cold current down my spine. I left the suite and rushed down the stairs barefoot, gripping the hem of my nightgown. At the junction between the garage corridor and the main foyer, Beck was walking with Santino draped over his shoulder. Santino was favoring his left side, his right hand clamped against his left arm, and between his fingers, even in the weak hallway light, I could see the dark stains spreading through the fabric of his shirt. Blood. My stomach lurched. I swallowed the panic, locked my jaw, and walked toward them with a steadiness my body manufactured on its own, because inside me everything was screaming. Beck noticed me first, and shifted Santino's weight without breaking stride. "Graze," Beck said, with the economy of a man filing a routine report. "Left shoulder. Ambush near the Port District." "I'm fine," Santino said, but his voice came out too strained to support the claim. "You're bleeding in your own hallway," I replied, ducking under his arm and taking on the weight Beck had been carrying alone. "Upstairs." "Now." Santino glanced at me sideways, and for a fraction of a second I saw surprise move across his face, the surprise of a man who hadn't expected to find anyone waiting. He didn't argue. The three of us ascended the main staircase together, Beck, Santino, and me, one step at a time, and I felt his body lean into mine with a solidity that made distance impossible to fake. His blood soaked into my nightgown at the shoulder, and the metallic smell of iron mixed with the cologne I already knew at close range. In the suite, Beck lowered Santino onto the edge of the bathtub and left with a nod, pulling the door shut behind him. I was alone with him in the bathroom. White tile, harsh overhead light, a faucet dripping in the silence that rushed in the moment the door closed. I pulled the first aid kit from beneath the sink. I knew exactly where it was because I had organized that entire bathroom during my first weeks in the house, back when arranging cabinets was the only thing that gave me the illusion of controlling something in my life. I unfastened his shirt buttons one by one, peeling the soaked fabric away from his shoulder, and examined the wound. The graze was genuine, a strip of torn skin along the outer curve of his left shoulder, still bleeding, but without the depth of a round that had gone in. The bullet had passed close enough to shear off a band of skin and kept traveling, and the relief that flooded through me was far too intense for a woman who supposedly felt nothing. "This is going to sting," I said, pressing the gauze into the antiseptic. "I've been shot before," he answered, staring at the wall ahead. "Congratulations. It's still going to sting." I cleaned the wound without speaking, my hands steady, my movements precise in a way I couldn't quite explain. Maybe from all the years of patching up Lazaro when he was small and wiped out on his bicycle every weekend. Maybe from whatever part of me operated better under crisis than in calm. Santino didn't react while I worked. No flinch, no clenched teeth, no visible acknowledgement of pain, and I couldn't decide whether that impressed me or frightened me. I tore open the pack of butterfly strips and pressed 3 along the gash, each one drawing the skin inward, until the edges met. I layered folded gauze over everything and secured it with crossed tape, tight enough to stem the bleeding, loose enough not to restrict his arm. It wasn't surgical. It was what I knew how to do, and it was what the wound required. When I finished, I washed my hands at the sink and turned to face him. His shirt hung open, his shoulder was wrapped in white, and the bathroom light traced the ridges of his abdomen in shadows I told myself not to look at, and looked at anyway. "Done," I said. "You'll survive." He studied the bandage, then shifted his gaze to me, and something in his expression changed. It wasn't gratitude. Santino's face didn't know how to form gratitude. It was something deeper, something arriving in real time as he sat there looking at me with his blood on my nightgown, and my hands still trembling from the adrenaline. "Thank you," he said, and the word left his mouth with a difficulty that revealed how rarely he used it. I picked up his jacket to drape over the bedroom chair, and as I lifted it, a folded piece of paper slipped from the inside pocket. Small, creased once down the middle, covered in rushed handwriting that wasn't Santino's. I picked it up off the floor before he could stand. S. Amato, Doc 9, 11 p.m. My stomach dropped. I read the name twice, and on the second pass my memory pulled me back to the dark hallway. The study door cracked open, Santino's voice repeating those 2 syllables with the gravity of a verdict. Silas. S. Amato. Silas Amato. The pieces locked together with an almost audible click. The name whispered in the corridor, the note hidden in his pocket, the ambush that night. Someone inside the organization was feeding information outward, and that someone had a name beginning with S and a surname that fit the handwriting on that scrap of paper. Santino was watching me from the bathroom doorway, eyes sharp, and I could sense him waiting to see what I would do. I could hold on to it. I could store it as leverage for a day when I needed protection. I could hand the paper back and pretend I hadn't read a word, the way I pretended so many things in that house, that I didn't hear, that I didn't notice, that I didn't feel. I didn't keep it. I crossed the room with the paper in my hand and held it out to him. Santino took it, read it, and when his eyes came back to mine, they carried an intensity that stopped my breath. "Where did you find this?" "Inside your jacket. It fell when I went to hang it up." "And you read it?" It wasn't a question. I held his gaze and didn't look away. "I read it, and I've heard that name before. A few nights ago, passing your study door. You said Silas twice. I didn't understand what it meant then. Now I do." His face stayed perfectly still for 3 full seconds. I counted them, because counting was the only thing keeping me from breaking eye contact. Then he exhaled slowly, and the tension drained from his shoulders in a way I had never witnessed. It wasn't relief. It was the surrender of a man confronting a fact he could no longer contain. I knew. "Silas Amato," he said, his voice low. "Second-tier capo. He's been selling information to Korvac for months. Tonight's ambush was built on intel that only he had access to. What are you going to do?" Santino looked at the paper, then at me, and for the first time in 8 months, I felt him actually see me, not the contract wife, not the woman in the red dress who had provoked him at the enemy's party, not the silent figure who arranged table settings and slept alone. He saw someone who had just chosen a side, his, without being asked. "Tomorrow," he said. "I handle it tomorrow." The storm continued to batter the suite windows, and the sound of rain filled the gaps between our words. Santino rose slowly from the edge of the tub, bracing his weight on his good arm, and walked toward the bedroom balcony. I followed without knowing why, and found the two of them, him and the storm, competing for which one commanded more space. He leaned against the railing with his uninjured hand and stood watching the rain fall across the pines of Lake Forest. I stopped beside him, close enough to feel the warmth of his arm against mine, and the spray hit our faces with a coldness that clashed with everything happening inside. "You could have kept it," he said, without looking at me. "The name, the information. You could have used it against me when the time came." "I know. Why didn't you?" The question hung between us and the rain, and I considered all the answers I could offer, because it was right, because that's not who I am, because information hoarded out of spite turns rotten. None of them was complete. The truth was simpler and more terrifying than any of those explanations. I didn't keep it, because somewhere between the blood in the hallway and the bandage on his shoulder, I had stopped pretending I didn't care. "Because I live in this house," I said, and it was close enough to the truth. Santino turned his face toward me, and the distance between us contracted without either of us taking a step. Rain ran down his face, pressing his hair flat against his forehead, and his dark eyes held something he was fighting not to reveal, and losing. He tilted his head slowly, and his forehead came to rest against mine. It wasn't a kiss. It was a point of contact so small and so charged that it carried more weight than any kiss could have, and I felt his breath mingling with mine in the narrow space between our faces. "I don't know what to do with you," he murmured. So quietly the rain nearly swallowed the words. My heart was hammering in my ears. The warmth of his forehead against mine was the only warm thing on that balcony, and I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the accumulated weight of the entire night, the blood, the stitching, the name, the storm, come to rest on that single, fragile point where we touched. "Take your time figuring it out," I answered. He stayed there 1 more second. Then he pulled away, slowly, with the reluctance of someone releasing something they aren't ready to let go of, and went back inside. I remained on the balcony with rain striking my shoulders, and my forehead still warm where his had pressed against it. And I knew, with a certainty that unsettled me, that something between us had just shifted, something no contract had anticipated, and neither of us had planned. The storm raged through the night. I didn't sleep, but for the first time in 8 months, it wasn't because of loneliness. Chapter 5. The Choice in the Middle of the House. The next morning, I came downstairs to the breakfast nook and found Santino seated at the table with a mug of coffee in front of him, and nothing else. That detail alone was remarkable. In 8 months, I had never once seen him sit at that table without a stack of documents or an open screen serving as a wall between himself and the rest of the world. That morning, the surface was bare, just the mug, his hands wrapped around it, and his eyes tracking me from the doorway to the chair across from him. I sat, poured coffee, and waited, because I had already learned that with Santino Valieri, the conversations that mattered didn't begin. They surfaced, gradually, once he decided the silence had served its purpose. "I was cruel," he said. He didn't lift his gaze. His fingers rotated the mug in a slow, repetitive loop, and his voice carried that flat tone he used for statements that weren't up for discussion. Except this time, the statement wasn't a command. It was a confession. "That night," he went on, and I knew without needing more that he meant the anniversary table, the study, the sentence that had fractured everything, what I said, how I said it. It was cruel, and I knew it at the time. I held the mug with both hands, feeling the warmth of the ceramic against my palms, and let his words settle in the space between us before I answered. Part of me wanted to accept immediately, to rush toward the relief, take the admission, and reassemble the pieces as though that alone could erase what came before. But the other part, the part that had lain awake staring at the ceiling for 8 months of silence, the part that had set tables for no one and eaten alone with a ring too tight on her finger, needed to say what was true before accepting anything. "You hurt me," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected. Not just that night, every night before it. Every meal I sat through alone, every hallway I walked without finding you, every time I tried to take up space in this house, and you treated me like a clerical mistake someone had filed under your name. Santino looked up. I watched his jaw tighten, the automatic response of a man hearing something painful and wanting to close the door before anything else gets through, but he didn't close it. He stayed there, exposed, holding my gaze with a visible effort that told me more than words ever could. "This doesn't go away because you apologized once over morning coffee," I continued. "It's going to take time. I don't know how much, but I'm telling you now, because you need to hear it." The silence that followed was long, but it wasn't hollow. It was the silence of two people who had just spoken the truth and were recalculating the distance between them based on what remained. "I hear you," he said, finally. He didn't say I understand. He didn't say I'll fix it. He didn't offer a single promise he couldn't keep. He said only that he heard me. And from a man who had spent 8 entire months acting as though I made no sound at all. Those 2 words were worth more than any promise could have been. We finished our coffee in silence, but a different silence from all the others. For the first time, it was a silence we had both chosen, not one he had forced on me. That afternoon, the cars began arriving through the mansion's side entrance. I watched from the second-floor hallway window, 3 dark SUVs pulling into the interior courtyard. Men in suits stepping out with the stiff posture of people heading to a tribunal, not a meeting. The Valieri clan captains gathered in the mansion's basement, a room I had never seen the inside of, but whose existence I knew from the times I had heard the reinforced door in the west corridor open and shut with a heaviness that didn't belong in a family home. Beck had stationed 2 men at the top of the stairwell leading down, and the message required no translation. No one descended without being called. I wasn't called. But no one told me I couldn't stay at the top of the stairs. I sat on the last step of the main staircase, at the curve where the second-floor hallway met the foyer, and from there I had a partial view of the basement door, closed, heavy, the voices inside compressed to a low vibration that didn't let me distinguish words, but allowed me to read tones. Santino spoke first, in his usual measured register. Someone responded, Remo, most likely, the 52-year-old consigliere, who had regarded me since day 1 with the expression of a man evaluating a problem he would eventually need to address, but who had never once disrespected me. Then other voices, layered over each other, and the tone of the room shifted, grew tighter, more brittle, and I felt the change in the air even from a floor above. The door opened. Beck emerged first, holding it with one hand. Then came Silas Amato. I recognized him from the portrait I had assembled in my mind since the night of the note. Second-tier capo. Angular face, hair cropped close, and eyes that moved too quickly for a man with nothing to hide. He walked with his hands at his sides, no restraints, no visible marks, but everything in his posture announced that something had just changed for him in a way that couldn't be reversed. Behind him, 2 of Santino's men escorted him through the side door leading to the back courtyard. Silas didn't look up. He didn't see me, but I watched every step he took until the door sealed behind him, and the understanding of what that exit meant, what happened when a traitor left through the back door of a Valieri clan meeting, settled over me with a weight that was equal parts relief and dread. Santino appeared at the basement door last. He stopped, adjusted his shirt cuff with an efficient gesture, and looked up. His eyes found me at the top of the stairs. I didn't look away. He held my gaze for 3 seconds, face unreadable, posture controlled, no trace of what had just taken place below, and then tilted his head a fraction. It wasn't a bow, it was acknowledgement. You gave me the name. I dealt with it. He turned and walked down the corridor toward the study, and the basement door closed behind him with that definitive weight that sealed things never to be spoken of again. I stayed on the step for another minute, pulse steady, carrying the knowledge that the name I had handed over, the paper from the jacket pocket, the memory of his voice in the dark corridor, had just altered someone's life permanently. I didn't feel guilt. Silas had sold information that nearly got Santino killed in an ambush. The bullet that grazed his shoulder, the blood in the hallway, the wound I had closed with my own hands. All of it had Silas's name behind it. I would have given it up again. But knowing that didn't make it any easier to look at the back door and understand what was happening on the other side. The following evening, the mansion was quieter than I had ever known it. The capos had gone, Beck had dismissed the extra security detail, and Donna Marta had left dinner ready in the kitchen before heading home early, a plate of pasta, and a handwritten note that said only heat on low, Mrs. Valieri. The Mrs. Valieri tugged at the corner of my mouth, because Donna Marta was the only person in that house who called me that, without the words sounding like an empty formality. Dinner that night didn't happen at the long dining room table. Santino appeared in the kitchen while I was warming the pasta, uncorked the wine without asking, and placed 2 glasses on the counter. We ate there, perched on the tall stools, plates between us, the bottle within arm's reach, and the simplicity of the moment was so different from everything we had lived through that it seemed to belong to another house and another marriage. Somewhere between the second glass of wine and the comfortable silence that had replaced the hostile one, Santino spoke. Not about Silas, not about Korvac, not about business. He told me about the captain's dinner that afternoon, the moment when, in front of every man seated at the table, he had made an announcement. I hadn't been present. He told me now. I told them you're not an alliance, he said, turning the glass slowly between his fingers. That you're my woman. Not by contract, by choice. The words arrived with a warmth that started in my chest and traveled all the way to my fingertips. I tightened my grip on the glass to disguise the trembling in my hands, and looked at him. And Santino's face, for the first time, wasn't constructed to impress, command, or intimidate. It was open, vulnerable in a way that seemed to cost him more than any confrontation with the captains ever had. And what did they say? I asked. Nothing, because it wasn't a discussion. I laughed, a short, involuntary laugh that escaped before I could catch it, and I saw the corner of his mouth rise. Not a full smile. Santino Valieri didn't produce full smiles, but that half smile, rare and measured, was worth more than the laughter of any other man I had ever known. After dinner, we climbed the main staircase together. We didn't plan it. We didn't ask. We simply went up, our steps matching, and when he turned toward the master suite instead of continuing to the study, the change in direction said everything neither of us needed to put into words. The suite was dark. I lit the fireplace on the wall facing the bed, a stone hearth that had never been used in the 8 months I had slept in that room alone, and the amber glow filled the space with a warmth that transformed it entirely. Santino closed the door behind him, and the sound of the latch was definitive. Not a lock, but a decision. I turned to face him. He was leaning against the door, shirt without a tie, dark eyes catching the firelight, and his expression was that of a man who had spent 8 months constructing a wall, and had just resolved, with full awareness, to pull down the last of it. I felt the weight of his gaze travel over me, my shoulders, my neck, my hands that didn't know where to settle, and the air between us became so charged that breathing turned into a deliberate act. He pushed off the door and came toward me, slowly, each step measured, intentional, and I felt the floor tremble with his weight. Or perhaps it was my own heartbeat. I could no longer separate the two. When he stopped in front of me, the gap was so narrow I could feel his warmth without contact, and the blend of cologne and wine and burning wood made my entire body respond before my mind could intervene. He raised his hand and touched my face. This time he didn't stop. His fingers traced the line of my jaw to my chin, and his thumb came to rest at the corner of my mouth with a pressure so faint it was almost a question. I answered the only way that made sense. I lifted my face and pressed my mouth to his. The first kiss was slow, cautious, his lips against mine with a restraint I could feel splintering with every passing second, the pressure deepening gradually, his breath merging with mine. the hand on my face sliding to the back of my neck and drawing me closer with an urgency he was trying to mask and failing. I grabbed the front of his shirt and felt the fabric bunch between my fingers, and beneath it his chest rose and fell at a pace that contradicted every ounce of control he was attempting to maintain. The kiss shifted. The restraint collapsed entirely, and he kissed me with everything, deep, heated, carrying the force of 8 months of accumulated silence crashing down all at once. His hands moved to my waist and pulled me against him hard enough to lift me off the ground for half a second, and I wrapped my arms around his neck and felt the full solidity of that man against me, the broad chest, the rigid shoulders, the fierce heat radiating from his skin even through the fabric. He carried me to the bed without breaking the kiss. He lowered me slowly, his weight settling over me with a care that clashed with the intensity of his mouth, and when he pulled back to look at me, breathing uneven, dark eyes overtaken by something I had never seen in them before. Desire, yes, but beneath it a raw openness that made my heart tighten. I understood there was no return for either of us. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice rough, strained, carrying the visible effort of a man offering an exit, while everything in his body pleaded with me not to take it. "I've spent 8 months being sure of nothing in this house," I said, pulling him toward me by the collar. "This, I'm sure of." He didn't hesitate again. His mouth traced a path down my neck, warm, unhurried, and every point it touched set off a line of heat that spread across my skin and sank deep. His hands unfastened the buttons of my blouse with a deftness that felt almost unfair, and when the fabric slipped from my shoulders, the way he looked at me, still, jaw locked, breath suspended for a full beat, made me feel, for the first time in 8 months, that I existed completely. His shirt was next. I undid the buttons with fingers that trembled in a way that had nothing to do with fear, and when I touched his skin, it was warm, taut, marked by the bandage on his left shoulder that I had placed there myself the night before. I ran my fingertips along the edge of the gauze with a gentleness that surprised me, and he pressed my hand against the wound, holding it there, and looked at me with an intensity that said what no sentence could. "You took care of me, and I know what it cost you." After that, the tenderness gave way to everything else. He moved down my body with his mouth and his hands, alternating between kisses and touches that were firm without being harsh, tracing every curve with a deliberate attention that made me understand Santino approached pleasure the same way he approached everything, with precision, control, and a quiet devotion that revealed more than language ever could. His mouth found places I hadn't known existed, and the heat climbed in waves that made me grip the sheets with both hands and lose my breath between one inhale and the next. "Look at me," he said, his voice rough against my skin. I looked, and his eyes, dark, open, stripped of every layer he wore for the rest of the world, held me with a force greater than his hands ever could. When he returned to me and settled between my legs, the pressure of his body against mine was solid, heavy, real in a way that made it impossible to reduce this to simple want. He entered slowly, with a restraint I felt fracturing by the second, and the sound he buried against my neck, deep, involuntary, surrendered, traveled through my entire body. The rhythm began slowly, deliberately. Every movement, deep and measured, and I felt his breathing accelerate alongside mine, the weight of his shoulders over me, the heat building where our bodies met. I ran my hands down his back and felt the muscles strain beneath my palms, the visible battle to hold on to control while everything around us, the fire in the hearth, the ragged breathing, the sound of our bodies together, conspired to strip it away. "I'm not letting you go," he said, his forehead against mine, his eyes on mine. His voice was barely recognizable, fractured, raw, emptied of everything that made Santino Valieri seem untouchable. "I wasn't going anywhere," I answered, and the words came out broken by the breath I no longer commanded. The rhythm shifted, faster, more urgent, and language dissolved into breath and heat and the low sounds he could no longer suppress. I felt the tension climb to a point where my entire body trembled, and when I let go, the wave tore through me with a force that made me grip his shoulders and close my eyes. He followed moments later, his body seizing, a low sound muffled against my neck, his weight surrendering onto me with an abandon that contradicted every second of restraint he had maintained for 8 months. Our breathing returned in stages. The fire had burned low, amber light tracing shadows along his shoulders as he braced on his arms to ease his weight. He swept the hair from my face with his fingers, a slow, almost unconscious gesture, and looked at me with an expression I had never seen on any face, least of all his. The expression of someone who had just lost a war he had been fighting against himself, and discovered that losing was infinitely better than winning. "I'm not letting you go," he said again, so quietly the words barely formed. "I know," I answered, and I traced my hand across his face, feeling the stubble beneath my fingers, the jaw still warm, the eyes still open, still on me. "I know." He rolled to the side and pulled me with him, his good arm around my shoulders, and I rested my head against his chest, feeling his heart still beating too fast beneath my ear. The fireplace crackled softly. The entire mansion was silent, and there, lying against the chest of Santino Valieri, the man who had sworn he didn't want me, the man who had spoken the sentence that shattered everything, the man who had just come completely undone in my arms. I fell asleep, for the first time in 8 months, exactly where I was supposed to be. Chapter 6. The morning. He didn't expect. I woke to the smell of coffee and the warmth of the space beside me already fading, the sheet still holding the shape of him. Morning light slipped through the curtains, and the fireplace had died at some point in the night, leaving behind ash and the faint memory of burning wood. I sat up, pushed the hair from my face, and realized I was wearing his shirt, white, oversized, the sleeves swallowing my hands, without any memory of putting it on. He must have draped it over me while I slept, buttoning it carefully, in silence, without disturbing me, and the image of Santino doing that, quietly, deliberately, spread a warmth through my chest that I made no effort to contain. I went downstairs in his shirt, hair loose, bare feet on the cold stone of the hallway floor. The mansion felt altered that morning. The same corridors, the same tall windows, the same filtered lake forest light, but everything carried a different weight, as though the house had unclenched during the night, and finally allowed itself to breathe. In the kitchen, I found Beck. He was propped against the marble counter with a mug in one hand and a pastry in the other, one of Tavi's panzerotti from her last visit, which had apparently survived in the refrigerator with the tenacity of something refusing to be forgotten. Beck ate with the gravity of a man conducting a formal evaluation, and when I appeared in the doorway, he raised the pastry in my direction, his version of a greeting. "The panzerotto," I said, stopping short. "You found Tavi's panzerotto." "I did," he confirmed, chewing with deliberation. It was labeled, in large letters, with a heart dotting the I in Marchetti, "and you ate it anyway." Beck considered this with the solemnity of a man weighing a matter of principle. "I'd rather eat the panzerotto than endure her talking about the panzerotto." I laughed, and Beck, without looking at me, took another bite with the immovable expression of a man who had just delivered the longest speech of the week and had no intention of surpassing it. Santino appeared in the kitchen doorway while I was pouring coffee. He leaned against the frame with his arms folded and took in the scene. Me in his shirt, Beck finishing Tavi's pastry, the morning light flooding the kitchen, with an expression I had never seen on him before. It wasn't a smile. It wasn't control. It was something nearer to bewilderment. The bewilderment of a man who had walked into a moment of domesticity inside a fortress and didn't know it could exist there. "Good morning," I said, holding a mug out to him. Santino took it, and his fingers grazed mine on the transfer. Brief, warm, deliberate, a touch that stole my breath for half a second in the middle of an ordinary kitchen. He drank his coffee leaning against the doorframe, watching me with a gaze that no longer required armor, and I felt the quiet weight of being seen, not evaluated, not surveilled, seen. Beck finished eating, rinsed his hands at the sink, and left the kitchen with a minimal nod that translated to garage if you need me. We were alone, Santino and I, in the kitchen that had served for 8 months as the backdrop for solitary coffees and hostile silences, and the distance between that morning and everyone before it was so vast it felt like a different life. After coffee, we stepped through the kitchen door into the backyard. Santino walked beside me, his hand brushing mine without closing around it, and I registered every millimeter of that almost touch, as though it were happening for the first time. The mansion's garden stretched wide, pines, flower beds that Donna Marta tended on her own time, and at the far edge, a wooden deck extending over a narrow lake that mirrored the Chicago sky with a stillness that contradicted everything unfolding inside the house. We stood there for a while, shoulder to shoulder on the deck, facing the water, and neither of us spoke, because that silence didn't need anything added to it. It was a silence that had been earned. In the afternoon, I knocked on the door of Santino's study and walked in without waiting for permission, a habit I had developed over the past week that, strangely, he hadn't objected to. He was behind the oak desk, phone pressed to his ear, and when he saw me, he gestured briefly, 1 minute, and ended the call. "I need to tell you something," I said, settling into the chair across from him. He rested his elbows on the desk and gave me his full attention. I realized, with a clarity that caught me off guard, that it was the same chair any visitor would sit in, and that until very recently, that was exactly what I had felt like in this room. A visitor. Not anymore. "Lazaro wants to come visit," I said. My brother's name landed between us with the weight of a confession, because that was precisely what it was. For 8 months I had kept Lazaro hidden, protected, funded through an account Santino knew nothing about, and now I was speaking his name inside the study of the Valieri Capo, voluntarily, without anyone compelling me. It was trust, and we both understood the magnitude of what that meant. Santino didn't respond right away. The pause lasted half a second longer than any answer he had ever given me, half a second during which something crossed his face, quick, restrained, smothered before it became legible. It wasn't refusal, it wasn't anger, it was something else, something I couldn't decode at the speed it passed, and that he smoothed over so swiftly, I nearly convinced myself I had imagined it. "Of course," he said, and repeated, a shade softer, "Of course." I watched him for another moment, searching his expression for whatever I had glimpsed, or thought I had, but his face had already resettled into its current version, open, attentive, carrying the warmth he had been offering me since the night before. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was the instinctive caution of a man who lived surrounded by threats and processed every new piece of information through a security filter before allowing himself to feel anything about it. Maybe. I let it pass. It wasn't the time, and the morning had been too good to turn half a second of hesitation into an interrogation. He rose from the chair, came around the desk, and offered me his hand. I took it, and he pulled me to my feet, with a gentle firmness that still surprised me, because, despite everything, I was still adjusting to the idea that those hands, which commanded an empire and shattered crystal without flinching, also knew how to be careful. We crossed the foyer together, went out through the kitchen door, and followed the garden path toward the lake deck. The late afternoon had painted the sky above Lake Forest in shades of amber and gray, and the pines threw long shadows across the lawn that Donna Marta kept pristine, even though almost no one walked there. On the deck, we stopped at the edge, the lake stretching ahead, calm, holding the last light of the day on its surface. From there I could see, in the distance, the mansion's main gate, and at the top of the iron column, the familiar silhouette of the black hawk with its wings half spread, the symbol of the Valieri clan, stamped on rings, gates, and everything that bore the family name. I looked at the hawk, and remembered the first time I had seen it, 8 months earlier, when the car delivering me in a white dress and dry eyes stopped before that gate, and I looked up at the iron bird, and thought it resembled a sentence. That day, the hawk had meant confinement, an elegant cage with stone walls, and a husband who didn't want me. I looked down at my hand, at the ring on my finger. I turned the band slowly, the same unconscious habit I had repeated for 8 months, and stopped. The ring fit. It no longer pinched. I checked again, certain I was wrong, and the realization reached me with an unexpected softness. The ring hadn't changed. My hand had relaxed. Santino took my hand, without asking, without announcing it, with the ease of someone performing a gesture that already felt like routine, even though it had been invented the day before. His fingers threaded through mine, warm, steady, and I felt the weight of his hand, the same hand that signed verdicts, that gripped my wrist in the dark corridor, that brushed the hair from my face the night before, settle into mine with a gentleness he only allowed when he believed no one was watching. I looked at the hawk again, the spread wings, the dark iron against the sky, the silhouette that 8 months ago had looked like a threat, and now resembled something else, a sentinel, something that watched over what belonged to it, and I was inside. I stood there on the deck with Santino's hand in mine and the lake reflecting the darkening sky, and thought, in silence, that this was a choice, the first real one I had made in 8 months. Not a choice dictated by contract, by debt, by fear, or by the absence of alternatives. My choice, eyes open, carrying the full weight of everything I knew about this man, and about this world, and the imperfect certainty that I wanted to stay. Lena here, that wraps up Book 1, and I've already finished Book 2. You can get access to it for a really small fee. In his safe, I found a contract. The first line had my name, the second, the word transfer. The third knocked the air out of me. 3 weeks earlier, Santino had announced at the captain's dinner, with every syllable heavy, that I was his woman. I had fallen asleep with his hand on my waist. I had started to trust. But that wasn't all. While I slept, he was shaking hands with Arsen Korvac in the backyard, and in his jacket pocket, there was a note written by another woman from his past. And something is waiting for me on the other side of that discovery, a choice no wife should ever have to make. But I was willing to confront it. Like I said, that was just a taste of Book 2. To watch it uncensored, just click on the first link here in the pinned comment. I'll see you on the other side in a few seconds. Remember, just click on the first link down here in the comments, and Book 2 complete, no ads, no interruptions, will already be available for you. It's very simple. Book 2 is something I'm loving making. You're loving it too, so I promise there will be more. It's where you find increasingly spicy stories, a true dark romance. And precisely because this version is getting more and more heated, the video isn't well accepted publicly on YouTube. This closed environment is where I can actually share my essence and where I feel free to do my best work for you. More news coming soon. I'll be waiting for you on the other side.